Hey there, I'm Annemarie. I'm a genre fiction writer and editor, and welcome to my channel. Today I'll be talking about what I learned from the first unit of my personal curriculum titled Heathens, Witches, and New England, Religion, Power, and the American Imagination. I'll be linking my first video I did talking about my personal curriculum in the caption below, but I'm currently working on a historical fiction novel set during King Philip's War, which took place from 1675 to 1676 in New England. This is an area of history that I only had very cursory knowledge of before starting this writing journey, and I wanted to give myself a more structured plan of research for writing my book. So in this video today, I'm going to be talking about what I learned from Unit 1 and how I'm going to apply what I learned to the writing of my story. If you're curious about any of the books I've been reading for the research on King Philip's War, you can check out the blog on my website where I give a breakdown of my entire personal curriculum and the scheduling, so you can read them as well. For Unit 1, which was Worldmaking in 17th Century New England, I read 4 books and 1 short story. My topics for this unit were an overview of King Philip's War, the historical and religious construction of evil as depicted in the Christian figure of the devil, how the devil works as an epistemic framework for believers, and New England Indigenous mythology. I think that the greatest takeaway of this unit definitely fell under that first learning objective, which was just a general, better, deeper understanding of what King Philip's War was. And the first book that I read, which was Jill Lepore's The Name of War, King Philip's War, and the Origins of American Identity, was such a great introduction to this period of history. Because my story takes place during the war, I'm excited to weave in a lot of the details that I learned about what was happening to make my story more realistic. One of the key pieces of information that I learned was why the English felt so threatened by the indigenous people who were living here in New England when they arrived. The fears and anxieties that the English held about becoming savage themselves was rooted in a belief that Native Americans were a long-lost tribe of Israel, or had come to the land hundreds of thousands of years prior. So at the core of it, they were a quote-unquote primitive version of themselves. The English felt that Native Americans were somehow degenerate because of sin, and feared that having any similarities with them would result in their own damnation. I also learned about how supernatural evidence was used to support the conviction of criminals during trials, and that will absolutely feature in the major trial in my story. In addition, Lepore talks about the mass incarceration of Indigenous peoples on Deer Island in Massachusetts. These included people who had even converted to Christianity and were living an English lifestyle until the war, when they were seen as an other or a danger, even though many of them had given up their own native cultures. They were forced to live there during the winter, and a great majority of them died from starvation. During my reading, I felt that this was such an important detail to include in my story. Even though the events won't be taking place near Deer Island, I want to incorporate this with a side character and a side plot of the story to bring awareness to the fact that this did happen. Overall, Lepore's book was very detailed, interesting, and very thorough. I really appreciate how it went chronologically from the events leading up to the war, everything during the war, and then the aftermath of the conflict and how it lives on in American history for centuries afterwards. So I highly recommend it if anybody is interested in learning about King Philip's War. Growing up very religious myself, the next books on the devil were in some ways a reminder or a refresher of things that I already knew. These were The Origin of Satan by Elaine Pagels and The Devil, Perceptions of Evil from Antiquity to Primitive Christianity by Jeffrey Burton Russell. Pagels' book was a great reminder of how the devil is portrayed in the New Testament, and it was a really invaluable source of a lot of applicable Bible quotes that I want to be using within the dialogue of my Puritan characters. One of the more daunting aspects of this project is having to sift through the Bible to find applicable Bible quotes to use, and so I really appreciated this book for all of the references that it pulls up regarding the devil. I basically made a whole list of them to be able to reference later. Between these two books, though, the information that I found most interesting definitely came from Russell's book. He talks a lot about how different cultural, mythological, and folklore traditions influence the stories and depiction of the figure of the devil. I want to echo this imagery throughout my story, especially that of goats and snakes, witchy-esque cults, and disease, paleness, or pallor. Next, I read Nathaniel Hawthorne for the first time in my life, which I highly recommend to anybody who hasn't read him before. I absolutely loved the short story Young Goodman Brown, which essentially follows a newly married young Puritan man, Goodman Brown, who meets the devil on an evening walk and witnesses a witch's Sabbath. It was a great introduction to Hawthorne and really fitting for my story. The tension between the outward appearance and inward goodness and faith is a huge point that will also appear in my story. I love the atmosphere of this piece, that dark, unsettling tone, and I really want to emulate that in those more ominous moments of my story, especially because the deterioration of faith is such a huge theme that I'll be exploring. Finally, I read Spirit of the New England Tribes, Indian History and Folklore by William S. Simmons. This book wasn't originally on my personal curriculum list. Initially, I had several books that covered other Native American tribes that were not related to King Philip's War or the area in New England that I was looking into. I discovered that the term Algonquian refers to so many different people indigenous to North America, and they are each very different from one another, so a lot of the books that covered Algonquian culture didn't touch upon the people living in New England during King Philip's War. It was difficult to find deeper scholarly books to read, but Simmons was a great introduction. When the English colonists first came to America, they nearly immediately started a campaign of Christian conversion, which resulted in the loss of a lot of these indigenous mythologies at the time, either completely lost or they were warped because the people who were recording them were the English. The native tribe that will be featured in my story is very much inspired by the Wampanoag people, who were the tribe of King Philip. And King Philip was the Native American leader who united a bunch of the indigenous tribes living in New England at the time to fight against the English. So their culture was a focus during my reading. The book did a great job at giving me insight into Wampanoag beliefs and culture, especially those living on Martha's Vineyard. It also went over Narragansett and Mohegan spirituality, which sometimes overlaps, and gave some tidbits of insight into King Philip's War as well. Some of the highlights include familiar spirits of shamans such as crows, rattlesnakes, and hawks, and that shamans could injure enemies with herbal preparations, which is really interesting. Shamans during King Philip's War were reported by the English to have magical powers over dogs, forcing the creatures to be quiet and to obey them. The book also talked about how the sun is a great healer, so plants used for medicinal purposes by indigenous people should be dried in the sun so that their properties would be strengthened. I also learned that the Wampanoags and the Narragansett tribes believed in will-o'-the-wisps that lead people astray into the New England swamps. These examples are only a very small part of what I learned from this book. It was really very interesting, and there's a lot that I am super excited to incorporate. I had very little knowledge of Native American belief systems before I read this book, so I'm super excited to now have a very strong foundation for some of the major mythological and spiritual beliefs. I was also really interested in the male spiritual coming of age trials in the Wampanoag culture and how animals, which they believe to be specially attuned to the spiritual world, act as guides or embodiments of higher powers on Earth. Overall, I'm really pleased with how the structure of my personal curriculum has given me the space to research these topics, and also how the things that I'm learning are extremely applicable and have really set the gears rolling in my head for how to incorporate all of this into my story to make the world richer and deeper and that much more realistic and meaningful. You know, I do want my story to be deeply grounded in the very real issues that people were dealing with at the time, and I feel that the research that I've been doing has really given me a comprehensive understanding of the perspectives of all the different players in this conflict to be able to accurately represent them and reflect them in my story. While the general plot of my story hasn't changed much since I outlined it at the end of last year, I definitely feel that the story has grown in the depth of the scenes, and I've definitely made adjustments in that area to accommodate for all the new things that I'm learning about this time period. Let me know what you are learning about in 2026. Thank you so much for watching this video. Until next time, bye!